This workshop is meant as a supplemental training tool, and it is not intended to supersede any of the Commission's rules or public notices. Applicants should familiarize themselves with the relevant rules, orders, and public notices, and additionally, all of the examples that we will use in today's presentation are meant only for illustrative purposes. So, there you go. Regarding questions, we will have time, as Gary mentioned, later in this workshop to answer questions. If you're here in person, please go ahead and write the questions on the forms that were provided to you. There are extra copies at the registration table. We will collect those forms during the break. If you're watching this live, you can email questions to auctions1001@fcc.gov. And if you are watching this recorded version, once it's been posted online, you can continue to email questions to that address and we will answer them. As we go through the information today, I want you to keep in mind that this workshop can really be broken down into 4 basic goals. First, we want you to be familiar with the steps that will take place between today and the first round of bidding in the clock phase. Second, we want you to understand the options that are available for an applicant to commit to during the initial commitment window. Third, we want applicants to be prepared to make initial commitments, so we will walk you through the initial commitment bidding software. And fourth, we will explain the implications of committing to the different options. And finally, we will provide you with some bonus information. Namely, we are going to give you a sneak peek at the reverse auction bidding system, which will be used when we actually get to the clock rounds. Before I discuss what is coming next, let's take a second and review where we are. Applicants submitted applications to participate in the reverse auction. Commission staff reviewed the applications and sent the first confidential status letter to each applicant, informing the applicant about the completeness of its application and stations. We had a resubmission period, during which time the applicants were permitted to correct deficiencies in their applications, if there were any. And the next step in the process then is the, as Gary mentioned, second confidential status letter. Every applicant that submitted a FCC Form 177 will receive a second confidential status letter. This means even if an application was deemed complete in the first letter, you will get a second letter. The letter will be mailed to the contact person listed in the Form 177. And although the contact person does not have to physically be the person that signs, a delivery signature will be required in order for the packet or for the letter to be received. If the application is deemed complete in the second status letter, an applicant may make an initial commitment for each station that is also deemed complete in that letter. Finally, if the application is deemed complete, the second status letter will contain RSA tokens, as Gary mentioned. An applicant's authorized bidder must have an RSA token in order to make an initial commitment. Throughout this process, we will refer to participating stations. When we use that term, we mean a station that was selected on an applicant's Form 177 that is deemed complete and is thus eligible to have an initial commitment made for that station. The next step is going to be the initial commitment preview period. The preview period begins at 10 a.m. Eastern Time on Thursday, March 24th, and continues until the initial commitment window opens on March 28th. Once that window opens, applicants may actually make an initial commitment. The preview period provides the applicants with the opportunity to log into the system and see information about their stations, and we strongly encourage applicants to log in during the preview period. Next, the initial commitment window will open at 10 a.m. Eastern Time on Monday, March 28th. It will remain open for applicants to make initial commitments until the deadline at 6 p.m. Eastern Time on Tuesday, March 29th. Commitments must be made prior to the 6 p.m. deadline. Late commitments will not be accepted. An applicant that fails to commit to an initial relinquishment option for a station will not be qualified to bid in the clock phase for that station. We're going to pause on the initial commitment step now to do a deeper dive But before we demonstrate the initial commitment bidding software, I'm going to review a few basic concepts. Specifically, I am going to review the relinquishment options, remind you that the VHF bands have limited capacity and why that matters, explain what an initial commitment is and how we will use it, and finally, I will go over the options that are available for applicants to commit to during the initial commitment window. You may recall that there are 3 possible relinquishment options in this auction. Today, we are going to use the image of a box to represent each relinquishment option. The first relinquishment option is go off air. Bidders that bid to go off air may either relinquish their spectrum usage rights and exit broadcasting, or relinquish those rights to share a channel with another station post-auction. This go off air box, if you will, is the largest box by far. What I mean by that is that the auction system has an unlimited capacity to assign stations to go off the air. Remember, if an applicant's bid to go off the air is accepted in the auction and it becomes a winning bidder, the bidder will relinquish its 6 MHz channel for that station, and the station will not need to be repacked. The second relinquishment option is to move to the low VHF band. If a bidder becomes a winning bidder in the auction to move to low VHF band, or bidding to move to the low VHF band, that bidder will relinquish its channel in its pre-auction band and will be given a new channel in the low VHF band. Finally, the third relinquishment option is a move to the high VHF band. Again, if a bidder becomes a winning bidder bidding to move to high VHF, it will relinquish its channel in its pre-auction band and be given a new channel in the high VHF band. You'll notice that the boxes representing the VHF options are much smaller than the off-air box. Since space is limited in the VHF bands, only a limited number of stations can ultimately be assigned to move to those bands. Now that we've reviewed the relinquishment options and I've reminded you that the VHF bands do have limited capacity, we're going to talk about what an initial commitment is and how the auction system will use it. By making an initial commitment, an applicant is committing to relinquish the relevant spectrum usage rights for a station in exchange for the opening price option, in exchange for the opening price for the option or options that it, excuse me, that it selects, for the option or options that it selects during the initial commitment window, should that station be frozen at its opening price for one of its selected options. In other words, if an applicant commits to an option for a station during this window, it should understand that the system may assign the station to that option, and it is possible that the station will ultimately relinquish the spectrum usage rights for that station for that option at the opening price. Only applicants whose Form 177s were deemed complete in the second confidential status letter may make an initial commitment, and only for stations that are also deemed complete. Now that we've reviewed what an initial commitment is, let's talk briefly about how the auction system uses initial commitments. Here we see a simple depiction of all the broadcast stations in their pre-auction bands. A number of them apply to participate in the auction and commit to an initial relinquishment option. Every broadcast station participating in the auction must be assigned to an initial option before the clock phase of the auction can begin, either to go off air, move to low VHF, move to high VHF, or they must be designated to be repacked in their pre-auction band. This means that, for instance, this group of stations that committed to an option during the initial commitment window must be assigned to an option before the clock phase can start, which would end up looking something like this. So, how does the auction system know which stations are going to be assigned to which options? That's where the initial commitment comes in. The auction system will ultimately use the options that an applicant commits to in order to set the initial clearing target for the incentive auction and to assign each station to an option at the beginning of the auction. The next logical question is, well, which relinquishment options can an applicant make a commitment to? And how does the auction system determine which of those options you're ultimately going to be assigned to? I'm going to cover which options an applicant may commit to. Later in the presentation, my colleague Melissa will unravel for you how those commitments get turned into the initial option that a station will be assigned to at the start of the auction. So, an applicant that selected all of the available options, an applicant that selected all of the available options on its Form 177 for a UHF station will have the option of committing to go off the air, move to low VHF, or move to high VHF during the initial commitment window. An applicant that selected all of the available options on its Form 177 for a high VHF station can commit to go off the air and or move to low VHF during the initial commitment window. An applicant that selected a low VHF station on its Form 177 can commit to go off the air. This is the only option available to a low VHF station, therefore the only option that is available for it to commit to. As we just saw, many applicants have several relinquishment options that may be available to their stations. The initial commitment is where the applicant selects which option or options it is willing to commit to and which of its available options is its preferred option. An applicant must commit to a preferred option in order to become qualified to bid for that station in the reverse auction clock phase. An applicant's preferred option is the relinquishment option that the applicant would most prefer to be assigned to at the beginning of round 1 of the clock phase. If an applicant does not commit to a preferred option for each of its stations prior to the 6 p.m. deadline on March 29th, that station will not become qualified to bid in the clock phase. If an applicant would most prefer to move to low VHF or move to high VHF in the first round of the auction, the applicant may also commit to one or more fallbacks. A fallback option is a relinquishment option that an applicant would like the auction system to consider assigning the station to if the auction system cannot accommodate the preferred option. If an applicant selects a fallback option, it is making a binding commitment to relinquish the associated spectrum usage rights for the opening price for that option in the event that the station is assigned to that fallback option and is frozen at the opening price. Remember how we earlier discussed that there is limited capacity in the VHF bands. Because the auction system may not be able to fit every station that prefers to move to low VHF or move to high VHF in those bands, and we want as many stations as possible to be able to participate in the clock phase if they would like to, the system gives such applicants the option of committing to these additional relinquishment or fallback options. The system will only consider a fallback option if the applicant's preferred option cannot be accommodated. And as we discussed a moment ago, using the initial commitments made by the applicants, the auction system will determine an initial option for each participating station. The initial option is the relinquishment option assigned to a station at the start of the reverse auction clock rounds. The initial option will always be one of the initial commitments that was made for that station, whether as a preferred or fallback option, if that's applicable. Now, I just went over a lot of definitions and words, so let's take a moment and go through an example of what it would look like if stations are making initial commitments. First, let's say that the applicant's for this group of station prefers to go off the air as their preferred option. This means that at the start of round 1 of the clock phase, go off air is the relinquishment option that this group of applicants would most prefer the station to be assigned to. Next, let's say that the applicants for this group of stations most prefer that the station be assigned to move to the low VHF band. Because the low VHF band has limited capacity, meaning it is possible that not all stations that prefer to move to low VHF may be able to fit in low VHF, the applicants for this group of stations may also commit to fallback options. So, in this case, the applicant for the UHF station here that prefers to move to low VHF has committed to 2 fallback options: go off the air and move to high VHF. So as you can see, this applicant is utilizing its ability to commit to all 3 of the options it selected on its form. 1 is a preferred and 2 is fallbacks. The second applicant here, UHF station, has declined to make any fallback options, which is also something that it is allowed to do. It does not have to commit to more than 1. You only have to commit to the options that you are willing to consider. Finally, let's say that the applicants for this group of stations most prefer that the station be assigned to move to the high VHF band at the start of the auction. Again, because there is limited capacity in the high VHF band, these applicants may not be able to be assigned to the high VHF, to move to the high VHF band. So they may select fallback options. Here, one of the stations selects a fallback of go off air. One selects both go off air and move to the low VHF band. One selects only move to the low VHF band, and one declines to make any fallback bids. So as you can see, again, these stations are utilizing and committing to the various options that were available to them if they selected those options on their form. In this example also, the stations remaining at the top there are ones that either are not participating in the auction or ones that did not make an initial commitment. Those stations will be designated to be repacked in their pre-auction bands. So, now that we've reviewed what the relinquishment options are, discussed the capacity of the VHF band, explained what an initial commitment is, and gone over the options that are available for applicants to commit to during the initial commitment window, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Jonathan McCormick, and he is actually going to walk you through what the bidding screens look like for the initial commitment system.
All right, so as Aaron mentioned, the software will actually become, the system will become available for preview period starting at 10 a.m. on Thursday, March 24th. Once the system becomes available, it can actually be accessed by clicking on a link on the main auction homepage. And the details for how to log in, URL, all that will be included for applicants who have applications deemed complete in their second confidential status letter. So all users that are wanting to make an initial commitment must first log in to access the system. Applicants will receive their username and token for each authorized bidder indicated on the Form 177. And here we'll show the process to log in as an authorized bidder for an applicant. All fields are required to log in, and please note that when you're first logging in, if you haven't logged in before, you'll actually leave the PIN field blank and go through a process to set up a new PIN. We're not going to go through that. It's in the user guide. It's not that difficult. And if you run into any issues logging in, please reach out to the technical support team during the preview period, during the initial commitment window. They should be able to help you with that. And as the lawyers have reminded me, please remember that each RSA token used to log in may only be used by a specific person with the person's FCC-supplied username. And in order to make initial commitments and bid for stations, an authorized bidder must use the specific token provided by the FCC and its associated username, as well as the password and for the FRN used on the applicant's Form 177. Please use the preview period to confirm that each person who is an authorized bidder has the correct token and knows which token is associated with which application and stations. Remember to safeguard your tokens. If we have to replace it or assign a new user, it's somewhat of a time-consuming process, so please make sure that you hold on to these things. All right, so you guys may have seen this if you've already seen the initial commitment tutorial video. We went through some of this stuff. I'll be going into a little bit more detail here. But upon logging in, users navigate through the auction system by clicking on links in the left-hand side. As you see, there's sort of a left menu bar there. For the initial commitment, a user will be able to navigate to 3 different screens in the auction system. Make commitment, where users will be able to commit to an initial relinquishment option for their stations. Messages, where users can view announcements and send messages to the FCC. And station info, where users can view static information about their stations for which they submitted an application that was deemed complete. The system will also display the name of the authorized individual logged in and allow the user to log out, lock their screen. Fairly self-explanatory. And on every page, the system will also display the name of the applicant and their FRN, the current stage, here it's the initial commitment window, but sort of a stage, the current time and date, and a countdown timer. Before the initial commitment window opens, the countdown timer will display the time until the initial commitment window opens. And then once the initial commitment window is opened, it will show the amount of time remaining until the window closes at 6 p.m. on March 29th. Users with applications deemed complete will be able to log in and access the system using the system during the preview period, starting at 10 a.m. on Thursday, March 24th. And during this preview period, users can familiarize themselves with the system. They'll be able to access both the messages, you can see here, and the station info screen. However, please note that until the window opens, the Make Commitment screen, you'll just see this message here. You can't actually access it and do anything until that window opens. Again, that's 10 a.m. March 28th, Monday morning, March 28th. So keep that in mind. So let's go a little bit deeper into this. Users will be able to access the Messages screen, again, during the preview period and also during the initial commitment window, in order to view announcements sent by the FCC or compose a private message to send to the FCC. To send a message to the FCC, users can click on a Compose New Message button, which will take them to a new message screen. On this screen, a user can enter a subject and message, and then click on the Send button in order to send a message to the FCC. It's pretty straightforward. Users will also see on their screen an unread message count next to the Messages link on every screen. From the Messages screen, users will also be able to read announcements by clicking on the View Entire Announcement link, which, once you've clicked it and read it, will mark that message as read and decrement the unread message count. Again, during the preview period and during the initial commitment window, you'll be able to access the station info screen in order to view some information about each of the stations that has an application deemed complete. Please note that the information on this screen does not change throughout the reverse auction. In this example, this user submitted an application for one station that was deemed complete. When the window opens, it will be able to make an initial commitment for this station. On the station info screen, users will be able to see the relinquishment options selected on its form for that station, as well as the opening prices for each option. Please note that if you go to the top, there's a little print screen link that you can print the screen for your records. Once the initial commitment window opens, users may submit their initial commitments on the Make Commitment screen as shown here. For each station, a user can choose to commit to its preferred relinquishment option from the drop-down menu. A user can choose from any relinquishment option selected on its Form 177 for that station. Alternatively, if the user no longer wants to bid for a station in the clock phase of the reverse auction, it can choose to decline to commit to any option. If a user declines to commit to an option for a station, that station will not participate in the clock phase of the reverse auction and will instead be designated for repacking in its pre-auction band. Once a user has chosen its preferred relinquishment option for a station, it must click on the Submit button in order to complete its initial commitment. Please note that if a user does not submit its initial commitment by the close of the initial commitment window, that station will not participate in the clock phase of the reverse auction. It's treated as if you've declined all of your commitment, declined to commit to anything. For each station, the system will display a green check mark and provide the time and date of the submission for a successfully submitted initial commitment. And users can also print a screen by clicking on the print screen link as a confirmation of its submissions. As a note, users should print a copy once all commitments have been submitted for your records, because after the window closes, this screen will become unavailable and users will no longer be able to print a confirmation of their submissions. So this is your chance to do that. At any point, while the initial commitment window remains open, users may modify submitted commitments for each station by clicking on the Change button. When modifying a submitted commitment, a user can choose from the drop-down menu its new preferred relinquishment option for that station. Once a user has chosen its new preferred relinquishment option, it must once again click on the Submit button for any modifications to take effect. Please note that until the user submits this modification, the previously submitted bid will remain submitted in the system. So if you decided ultimately, after selecting to go off air, that you want to decline your commitments, please make sure to submit that, or else it will not take effect. So far, we've seen how to commit to an option that can always be accommodated by the system. But as my colleague Aaron was mentioning, there's a whole lot of situations if you're trying to move to one of the VHF bands where that might not be necessarily the case. So in this case, if a user selects as his preferred relinquishment option to move to low VHF or to move to high VHF, and the station had more than one bid option available to it and selected it on its application, the user must make a fallback option selection. Here's what it looks like. A fallback option will be considered if the auction system is unable to accommodate the user's preferred relinquishment option for a station. Please note that because the auction system is always able to accommodate an off-air relinquishment, a user that wishes to ensure that a station will be able to participate in the clock phase of the reverse auction should choose as either its preferred option or at least as a fallback the option to go off-air in the system. A user can select as its fallback option either one or both of the relinquishment options if it's available for that station. And a user that does not wish to commit to any option except for its preferred option can decline all fallbacks. In this case, if the auction system cannot accommodate your preferred option for the station, that station will not participate in the clock phase of the reverse auction and, as mentioned before, will be designated for repacking in its pre-auction band. Before a user can submit its commitment for a station whose preferred option may not be accommodated, in other words, if you get prompted for this fallback option, you must make a selection, either to decline all fallbacks or to select one or both of the options available before you can actually click the Submit button. If you do not, and you can't click the Submit button, it's not going to be submitted in the system, and you could be deemed as, to drop out, to decline your commitments and not participate in the auction. So make sure to make a selection there. In general, the Make Commitment screen looks identical for users with a single station or with multiple stations, just that you have more of them. For users with multiple stations, since there are more stations for which a user may commit an initial relinquishment option, The user may need to scroll down the screen to see all of them, but they will be presented on a single screen here. As described earlier, users can choose their preferred option for each station by selecting from a drop-down menu, then clicking the Submit button. This is done individually for each station on your screen. For users with multiple stations, the system displays a notification at the top of the screen showing a count for which, of the number of stations for which a user has not yet submitted an initial commitment. This notification will turn green once all of your stations have a submitted commitment. Remember that a user will only see relinquishment options that were selected on the applicant's Form 177 for each station. For example, if an applicant has a station whose pre-auction band is UHF, but for which it selected only the move to low VHF option on its form, that user will only be able to commit to move to low VHF or decline commitment in the auction system. Similarly, if the pre-auction band for a station is low VHF, or in this case high VHF, fewer relinquishment options are available. As a result, a user can only commit to those relinquishment options available for its station. As discussed earlier, if a user chooses as its preferred relinquishment option for a station an option that requires a fallback selection, the user must check the box for one or more fallback options, or check the box to decline all fallback options before it can submit its initial commitment for that station. Once a user has submitted initial commitments for all of its stations, the system will display a notification, as I mentioned before, at the top of the Make Commitment screen. It will turn green. As a reminder, users should print a copy of this screen for their records as a confirmation that all commitments have been successfully submitted. This is what it generally looks like. After the close of the initial commitment window, this screen will once again become unavailable, so users should make sure that they have printed a confirmation of their submission before the window closes. Do I need to repeat that for a third time? Please print your page. It will be very, very useful for you to have a confirmation. Please also note that the auction system will become unavailable shortly after the close of the initial commitment window at 6 p.m. Eastern Time on Tuesday, March 29th. All users that wish to make an initial commitment for their stations and thereby participate in the clock phase of the reverse auction should make sure to submit all commitments for all of their stations by the close of the window. Hopefully you can see that it wasn't actually all that complicated. There's not that much to the system, and even though the concepts might be somewhat a little daunting, actually placing these things and making these commitments is actually quite easy. But to see how we get from the commitments that people submit to setting an initial clearing target and ultimately getting to the clock phase of the reverse auction, I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague Melissa to explain how we get to the clearing target.
Hello. So we have so far talked quite a bit about situations where a station might not be able to be accommodated. What do we mean by that? If a station can't be accommodated, and in what situations does it occur? That's what I'm going to attempt to explain to you and carry on the example that Aaron set up to show you how during the initial commitment period, during the initial clearing target period, the auction system determines the initial options assigned to participating stations and determines if any of those stations cannot be accommodated. Once the initial commitment window closes, the auction system will set an initial clearing target. That's the next step. As part of that process, the system assigns initial options to participating stations. In the Bidding Procedures PN, we described how mathematical optimization software is used in setting the initial clearing target, and we provided a lot of details about that process. I'm sure you read all of them. I will quickly summarize the process here. The input to the optimization software is the initial commitments made by the participating stations, and it also includes a list of non-participating stations that need to be repacked. The output of the optimization software is an assignment of stations to initial relinquishment options and to provisional channels. The optimization software is run for each of the band plan scenarios. The highest band plan with an assignment that meets the Commission's near nationwide standard for impairments will be the initial clearing target. If a participating station's initial commitment can be accommodated, the station will be assigned an initial option. All other stations will be designated to be repacked in their pre-auction bands and assigned a final channel at the conclusion of the incentive auction. These include non-participating stations, stations that are not needed in the auction, and stations whose initial commitments cannot be accommodated. What do I mean by stations not needed? Well, as part of the process of setting an initial clearing target, the optimization software will determine if there are any participating stations that will always have a feasible channel in their pre-auction band at the initial clearing target or any possible subsequent clearing targets. Any such stations are not needed to participate in the auction, and we will inform an applicant before the clock phase begins if any of its stations fall in this category. So continuing with the small example that Aaron presented earlier, I'm now going to walk you through how the optimization software would assign initial options to those participants in our example. Here we are at where we left off with Aaron. Since the go off air option has unlimited capacity, all the stations that picked go off air as their preferred option will be assigned to that option as their initial option. That's the easy part. Looking at the other two relinquishment option boxes, it gets a bit more complicated. On the right here, we have the participating stations that want to move into the low VHF and high VHF bands as their preferred option. And in the upper left, we have the non-participating stations that must remain broadcasting in those bands. Since the optimization software must ensure that all non-participating stations can continue broadcasting, there may not be many slots available in our move to low VHF and high VHF relinquishment option boxes in the middle. How many participating stations can be initially assigned to those options? And what's the best way to repack the non-participating stations to ensure that the most number of participating stations are accommodated? Well, this is where the optimization software comes into play. There's potentially lots of ways to arrange the stations. So what we do is we provide it goals, and based on the goals, the optimization software determines the best assignment of stations to provisional channels and initial relinquishment options. So let me walk you through those goals that are provided to the optimization software. First, the optimization software will try to minimize the number of participating stations that will not be assigned an initial option. That is, that they will not participate in the auction. We don't like that. We want everybody that wants to participate in the auction to be able to participate. Keep in mind, though, that going off air can always be accommodated. Have we said that a few times? Next, the optimization software will try to assign as many participating stations to their preferred option as possible. If a participating station must be assigned to a fallback option, the optimization software will attempt to assign it to the go off air option if it was selected as a fallback. Why do we give priority to the go off air option as a fallback? Well, because it provides the station with the greatest flexibility to later switch to another relinquishment option it's selected on its Form 177 during the clock phase, based on the bidding hierarchy. We'll talk more about the bidding hierarchy later when we get to the sneak peek of the clock phase bidding software. So coming back to our little example, let's say that the optimization software determined an assignment of participating stations to relinquishment options that looks like this. You will notice that only 2 spots were available in the move to low VHF and move to high VHF relinquishment option boxes. In other words, based on the non-participating stations that will remain broadcasting in those bands, only one of the participating stations that preferred to be assigned to the move to low VHF option could be accommodated. And similarly with the high VHF relinquishment option. The remaining stations whose preferred option could not be accommodated will be designated to be repacked in their pre-auction band, just like this. There they go. And now we arrive at the shining moment of my presentation. Do not be intimidated by the density of the information in this table. It contains the key to all your questions. That is, all your questions about what the possible outcomes could be for your stations based on what you commit to during the initial commitment window. I'll start by breaking down what information is contained in this table, and then I'll go through a few of the scenarios. The first two columns show all the possible combinations of initial commitments. The first column shows the three possibilities for a preferred option: go off air, move to low V, move to high V. The second column shows all the possible fallback options given the preferred option listed in the first column. The third column lists for each initial commitment combination the order of priority used by the optimization software when determining initial options. And finally, the last column indicates yes or no if at least one of the initial commitment options can always be accommodated. Now let's look at a few of the scenarios. Here we have a go off air as the preferred option. Since it can always be accommodated, a fallback is not applicable. The optimization software will assign the go off air option as the initial option. And so yes, in that scenario, an option can always be accommodated. Next, let's look at a scenario where the preferred option is moved to low VHF. Let's see. I lost my mouse here. Okay. The applicant selected both possible fallback options, go off air and move to high VHF. The optimization software will first attempt to assign that station to its preferred option of move to low VHF. And if that cannot be accommodated, then it will assign it to the go off air option. Because the go off air option was selected as a fallback, at least one option can always be accommodated in this scenario. Moving on to a preferred option to move to high VHF. Let's say in this scenario that the applicant only selected move to low VHF as a fallback. When the optimization software is determining the initial option for this station, it will first attempt to assign that station to the move to high VHF relinquishment option. If that cannot be accommodated, second, it will try to move it to the low VHF relinquishment option. And if that cannot be accommodated, finally, it will designate it to be repacked in its pre-auction band. So in this case, it's not always possible for an option to be accommodated. Last example here, an applicant that selected move to high VHF declined to make any fallbacks. During the initial clearing target, the optimization software attempts to assign that station to move to high VHF. If it cannot be accommodated, the station will be designated to be repacked. And so again, in this case, an option cannot always be accommodated. So to summarize, if a participating station is needed in the auction and selects the go off air option as either its preferred option or a fallback option, it will be in the auction, guaranteed. If a participating station is needed in the auction and only selects moving to one of the VHF bands as its preferred option, and either declines to select fallback options or selects moving to the other VHF band as a fallback option, it may be repacked in its pre-auction band and therefore may not be in the auction.